What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another Mcreator tutorial. Today's tutorial is probably one of the most requested tutorials of all time I've ever gotten, and it is going to be how to do a furnace-like GUI. Now, this tutorial is going to be a little bit different, mostly just because when it comes to GUIs and workbenches such as like a furnace, it's gonna vary. The exact way you want your furnace to work is very unlike it's unlikely that it's the same as the way this works, the crucible, which is what we're going to be talking about today. This is something of my own invention in my mod, A.C.E.'s MC overhaul, but it's just unlikely that I can tell you verbatim, step by step, exactly how to make the exact GUI and the exact workbench and furnace like item that you want. So instead, what I'm going to do is walk you through how I went about creating the crucible, which is a furnace like item in my mod, and just kind of tell you all the concepts and information you need to know so that hopefully I will enable you to be able to make whatever you want. But of course, by the end of this tutorial, if you're still struggling, still not quite figuring things out, or you just want a helping hand, feel free to join our community Discord. The link is in the description down below. But without further ado, here is my Crucible GUI. I designed this myself. I had to draw the arrows, I had to draw the flame, and I had to draw in the gauge. These are all sprites. I drew all of them myself. It's kind of annoying. I'll actually link them all in the description if you want any of these images yourself. I think this arrow here is something a lot of you will end up downloading. But without further ado, let me quickly explain how this works. So essentially, in the Crucible, I can put different types of stone, and when I put them in here along with a special kind of fuel, it has to be a tier 2 fuel, a special ultra strong fuel, then it will melt that stone down and deposit lava into the crucible. Here you can see it says tank level. I should probably put this at lava level or just lava or something like that, and this is the millibucket count on the back end. So if I go ahead and put a magma shard in here, you'll see that immediately it consumes that magma shard, puts my fuel at max, and starts smelting my blackstone. Now, once my blackstone goes all the way to the end, you'll notice that my lava counts up. It plays a little lava sound there, and throughout the whole thing, my fuel here is slowly depleting. So it's going to continue to do this. My fuel's going to keep depleting, and I think it's going to smelt roughly 4 items, I think, is how many it smelts with a magma shard. However, if I use a blaze rod, I think it should smelt about 6 items, and if I used a soul flame, it should smelt about 8 items. I'm not going to bother demonstrating all of that for you, but I will show you the code that I wrote to make all of this work. It's actually fairly easy, with one big area that takes most of the work. So in order to make things easy for you, I would highly recommend first and foremost creating 2 categories. Your fuel category, where you basically list every single item that you want to possibly be fuel for your system. So this is all 3 fuel items I have. And then your material category, or basically anything that you want to have a special recipe for. So this isn't actually all of it. Pretty much anything tagged as stone or anything that is a type of stone can be smelted in my crucible. So this isn't everything, but it's an example of everything. So we have our fuels and our materials. These are 2 things that you're probably going to want to work out immediately, and then you have to ask yourself 2 questions. The first of which is, do you want all of your fuel to contribute the same amount of cook time, or do you want your fuel to be varying strength? Like I said, my fuel is varying strength, so magma shard is the weakest fuel, and soul flame is the strongest fuel. The next thing you have to consider is the smelting result, or whatever the result is gonna be. In theory, as long as, blackstone, stone, and deep slate all have the same smelting result, you can code them as one single smelting recipe, and it's gonna save you a bit of time. However, for every single item that has a unique result, you're going to need to code by hand a unique recipe. Now, it's not writing code. You can still use the procedure blocks in Mcreator, but you're gonna have to make that recipe by hand. And this is it. this is literally everything. Every single thing that the Crucible uses can all be found right here. It's actually not that much. And we're going to start first and foremost with the GUI. So you can see the GUI. Every GUI I make, I start by putting a label of what the GUI is in the top left. I find this to be best practice, and this is what most of the GUIs for vanilla Minecraft do. I think not all of them, but most of them, almost all of them, follow this format of putting the label of what the GUI is in the top left, so I like to do it as well. I also have a display here, and if I double click that display, it'll open up this menu. You can see that it's not actually returning a value, but it's using a procedure here, tank 1 level display, and that is what's actually deciding what the display, actually displays. So let me real quick, now that actually isn't in here because that is a procedure that I reuse for a couple of different GUIs, but let me real quick look it up and show you what that procedure looks like. So essentially all I'm doing is returning text, create text, tank level, and so this is why it always says tank level. And if you need this, you can just search text up here and you should be able to find what you need right here, or you can just look right here, create text, text with, return text should be in flow control, return text right there. Get level of tank 1. This is the only tank on the entire block, so it's always going to be tank 1 of side any direction, and it's basically just going to return tank level. There is a space there at the end. Take note of that. If there is no space, you're not going to get a space between tank level and the number, but basically that's all it does, is returns tank level and then the number of the level of the tank. So it's a very simple procedure. Now here for my energy gauge, now I think if I'm not mistaken, actually this is a bug I have yet to fix. My energy gauge here should count up with whatever this tank level is. So I think I've got this backwards if I'm not mistaken, or slightly just slightly messed up. And actually I can see here exactly why it's not counting up, because I forgot to assign my procedure. So I do have a procedure here, Crucible Energy Gauge Index, and basically that is going to determine which gauge of this sprite is shown. So let me go ahead and save those changes and show you the actual image of this kind of gauge here. So this is actually my gauge texture, and as you can see, it's all of the textures, all coded or compiled into one long animation strip. And you can see here, if I click on this, I have that divided into 13 sprites. So it's going to take this texture and divide it into 13 even pieces vertically, and as you can see, if you counted all these gauge, that's exactly how many gauges are here. So it's dividing them into each gauge automatically for me, which is why you only see one gauge appear right here. Then my Crucible Gauge Index, my Crucible Energy Gauge Index procedure here is returning a integer value, 1 through 13, or I should say 0 through 13, or 0 through 12, because that would be 13 in total. And based on what number it returns, that is how it determines which gauge to display. So, real quick, let me show you that procedure. This is what that procedure looks like. I'm doing the same thing where I get the level of the tank, and if the level of the tank is less than 1, meaning it's completely empty, I return 0, meaning I tell it, hey, use that first one right up there at the tippy top, telling it, hey, it's empty. Else, if it's less than 750, which would be my first integer, basically what I did here, because there's 12 different sections, 13 if you include the first one, but we're not going to include the first one, 12, what I did was I divided my tank size, which is 9,000, into 12 bits. And if you take 9,000 and divide it by 12, you get 750. So after the first 750, as long as it's within the first 750, I return 1. If it's in with the second 750, I return 2. If it's within the third, 4, fourth, 4, fifth, 5, 6, 6, etc., etc. On and on. And what you'll notice is what I end up with is with a number 750 less than my maximum, so 8,250, I return 11. But if it's anything above this number, I just return max, and it's going to display as though it's full, even though it's not full. It's approaching full. Now that's actually how every single one of these sprites is going to work. So you can see here with my progress bar, it is also a sprite bar, and it also has a Crucible progress bar index procedure that will index and tell it which bar to use. Now that one should be, where is it? Crucible progress bar right here. Now that one is actually going to use an NBT number tag that I establish when the block is placed. So this one's getting a little bit of ahead of ourselves, and so is if we check out the flame index, which is also how the little fire here is determined and how it changes. It also uses an index. Both of these are getting just a little bit ahead of ourselves because it's gonna be, we need to know our NBT number tags. You need to know what each of these means, what each of these represents, and you just don't know what each of those means yet. So real quick, before we get into those, let me walk you through the Crucible block placed. Now there are only two procedures we have yet to cover: Crucible block placed and Crucible update tick. Now on my Crucible block here, it's got both of those, an on update tick and an on block placed right here, as well as the right clicked. Now the right clicked is pretty self-explanatory. For my machine, all it does when it's right clicked is if you have a bucket, it will fill that bucket with lava as long as it has enough lava to put in there. I also, you know what I just realized? I'm not draining. I have a bug. Hang on real quick. I totally forgot that it should actually drain the amount drained. Test draining, blah, 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 and return amount drained. If that amount drained is equal to 1,000, it needs to actually drain it. You could just get infinite lava here. That's a crazy bug. All right, that should be fixed now. But essentially, this all that right click does is handle the lava. You actually don't need a right clicked procedure if you don't have a custom right click behavior, because if you go into advanced properties, or excuse me, block entity properties, I believe, then you can make it so that the GUI is automatically opened on right click using this right here. Just check that box and your GUI will automatically be opened on right click. Make sure your Crucible GUI, or whatever your GUI is right here. Make sure you have block entity enabled. Perhaps the most important thing is make sure that this number is correct. It needs to be the size of the inventory of this GUI. So if I go to this GUI, do not include any of these down here. These are your inventory ones. They don't matter. They're not GUI slots. But this GUI has 1, 2 slots. So I have to make sure this number is 2. If this number is 1 or 3 or anything other than 2, and I have 2 slots, whenever I open my GUI, it's going to crash. It's going to crash my whole game. So make sure that that number is correct. And now we can talk about the Crucible block placed. So whenever I place the block, it's going to take 3 custom variables and tie them to block. The first variable is called fuel. This is how I determine how much fuel is currently in the system. So whenever I add, say, a blaze rod or a magma shard or a soul flame, or whenever I add any new fuel to the system, it's going to set that fuel to a higher amount. And based on what it sets it to, that is going to determine this flame and how much fuel I have left. My second number here, which I guess technically my third one here is smelt progress. Now smelt progress is how I control my progress bar up here. Based on the smelt progress, it will determine whether or not it should use stone, or excuse me, it determines whether or not to consume a stone and add lava. And then my final one here is fuel max. Because I have different levels of fuel, my fuel max is very important. It doesn't actually really matter what I set it to start with here. I don't think this matters at all. But my fuel max is very important because my fuels have different degrees, and I want this flame to show as full no matter what. And finally, that brings us to the Crucible update tick. This is the heart of the whole machine. It controls pretty much everything. Now, the first thing you need to know is I am using Blockstates, the Blockstate plugin. If you do not want to use the Blockstate plugin, I have no idea how you can make your machine turn on. So as you can see here, I have an, oh, wait a minute. that's a weird sound. I have an off texture and an on texture. So you can see when I put my flame in here, it turns on. If it was nighttime, you would be able to see that it is emitting light. There's even some flames out the back here, as you can see, get turned on. Now, it's not animated, but it could be animated if I wanted to. If you want this behavior to be able to kind of switch the texture into an on mode, you're pretty much going to have to use block states. Now, don't quote me on that, but as far as I'm aware, there is no way to have this behavior without the Blockstates plugin. I think it's required, but I'm not sure. And here is my Crucible update tick procedure. Now, I've actually filmed this several times. I have made several tweaks to this procedure as I run through it, just because I've actually discovered better ways of doing this procedure. And I want to make sure that you guys have the best possible tutorial and coding and recommendations for you. So the first thing we're going to do here is check our fuel. Remember our NBT number tag fuel that we set when our Crucible block was placed? We set it to 0. And if it's still 0, if it's less than 1, the reason I check less than 1 and not equal to 0 is sometimes this might get set to negative on accident or just by mistake because like a tick kind of hiccuped or skipped or something. And just in case that happens, I want to make sure that this still works. So instead of checking equal to 0, I check less than 1. If it is less than 1, then I check if we are good to go. If we have something smeltable in the slot and we have a fuel source in the slot, then go ahead and start up the machine. Else, let's make sure that our smelt progress is at 0. We've already established our fuel is at 0 or, less than 1. But if we're not good to go, nothing's good and we have no fuel, we need to reset our smelt progress back to 0. But if we are good to go, now here's where it gets tricky. I actually have multiple different types of materials that produce different outputs and multiple different types of fuel sources that produce different kind of inputs, right? So I control these via tags. If you're unfamiliar with tags, you can come back to your workspace, come over here to element tags, and I've got mine filtered by Crucible, as you can see up here, but all you have to do is add a new tag. Make sure that it's an item tag. You can give it whatever namespace you want and whatever name you want. Personally, my namespace is Crucible for all of my Crucible tags. And then the name is just whatever makes sense. So Crucible Fuel, here is all my Crucible Fuel. Here is everything that my Crucible can smelt. Here is the tier 0 smeltables. Here is the tier 1 smeltables. And here is the tier 2 smeltables. So if I come over here, I'm checking that it has anything smeltable in it and any fuel. If it does, well, hey, what type of smeltable? Is it a tier 0? If it is, the tier 0 smeltables produce 16 lava. So I'm going to check and make sure that my tank can hold at least 16 lava. If you have a standard furnace, what you would do here is check that the output slot is empty or less than 64 of whatever this output would be. So say this was a cobblestone and I wanted to check to make sure that the output slot was less than 64 stone or was empty. That's kind of the equivalent of checking my lava here. But if it is and it's good to go, I'm going to remove one fuel. I'm then going to check what fuel I just removed. Hey, was that which actually I have to do this before I remove, otherwise that's going to cause an issue. I'm only just realizing that. So I'm actually going to quickly drag and drop this if above, because if it's the last fuel source left and I remove it before checking, well, then I can't check anymore now, can I? So I'm going to have to check first. If it's my lowest tier fuel, I only get 800. That's about 4 items for me. If it's a blaze rod, I get 1200. That's 6 items. And soulfire, 1600. That is 8 items. I then remove the item and then turn my machine on. I'm using the Blockstates plugin. So turning it on sets the block state to 1. If you're not using the Blockstates plugin, come over to your actual furnace item, click on the Blockstates tab, add a new logic property. I would recommend calling it lit or just on and setting that to true right here. It then checks if it's a tier 2 smeltable or a tier 1 smeltable or a tier 2 smeltable and does the exact same thing. The only difference being that it checks if it's a tier 1, it checks if it's 32 lava, and if it's a tier 2, it checks if it's 64 lava. However, let's say that the machine is already on, right? Let's say that fuel is already greater than 1. So it's going to come down here, fuel greater than or equal to 1. Yep. Well, the first thing we're going to do is take fuel and set it to fuel minus 1. So we're going to subtract 1 from our fuel. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to check our smelting progress. Remember, smelt progress was set to 0 when the block was placed. So if this has just kicked on for the first time, smelt progress would be 0. So if smelt progress is greater than or equal to 200, which if it's only just starting, it wouldn't be. Editing Ace here to say that 200 determines how long the item will burn for. So if you want it to take longer than 10 seconds, then increase it by 20 for every second. But if you want it to take shorter than 10 seconds, decrease it by 20 for every second. So we would go if 200, nope, then else, go down here. So else we know we're turned on, and we know that we haven't completed our smelting progress yet. So what we do here is we go, hey, is there still an item in the smeltables, tier 0 item? And do we still have enough lava space left in the tank? Okay, cool. Then we're good. Let's go ahead and take smelt progress, set it to smelt progress plus 1. If it's not a tier 0 smeltable, hey, what is it? Is it a tier 1? Notice I have an or over here. So if it's this or this, or this. If it's any of these 3, then it's going to go ahead and increase our smelt progress. But if it's none of those 3, let's say that I do a sneaky and I remove the item from the smeltables slot, or I add lava to the tank, well, then it's going to catch that and go, hey, set that smelt progress back to 0. Something has changed, you know? Something's changed. We need to set that smelt progress back to 0. But let's say that that smelt progress is 200. Let's say that it's run this bottom one enough that it's ticked all the way up to 200. So now it's going to check this top one. Well, our smelt progress is done. So we want to produce our output. Basically, in order to produce output, here's what we're doing. If the item in that slot is tagged as a tier 1 or tier 0 smeltable, then I play my lava sound, I remove the item, and I fill 16 lava. Now, essentially what you would do here is whatever item that it is, you would produce the output. You would have to code this in manually. Yeah, for every single potential input that's different than the output, you got to code it all in manually. It's annoying. But for me, it's kind of easy because it's just 16 lava. And then I'm going to set my smelt progress back to 0. Then I check, oh, it wasn't a tier 0. Was it a tier 1? Oh, it was a tier 1, so we're adding 32 lava, but the rest is the same. Oh, it was a tier 3? You know, in fact, you know what I could do just to save myself some space, and what I will do just to save myself some space. These 3, they play every time. I don't really need to repeat them, do I? So I can just put them outside and you can see very clearly what I'm doing. So every time I'm playing my lava sound, I'm removing the item from the slot, and I am setting the NVT tag smelt progress back to 0. Now this is checking the item in that slot. So I actually have to have this above the remove item right there. But it's going to check the item in that slot. If it's a tier 0, it's going to fill 16 lava. If it's a tier 1, it's going to fill 32. And if it's a tier 2, it's going to fill 64. So here's where you would check what item you just melted and produce your output. Then remove the item and set your smelt progress back to 0. And now that we've covered everything in there, we are real quick gonna go over the flame index once again, and this fuel max and what it is, because I actually intentionally left it out. There are some things we need to add to this Crucible update tick. I just intentionally left out the fuel max. So now that you are more familiar with the fuel tag, what it's doing and how it works, then you should be able to get more familiar with the fuel max. So essentially all that fuel max is used for is to determine what type of fuel was used and what its maximum value is. So if we come back over to the Crucible update tick and expand this, you'll notice that the magma shards produce 800 fuel, the blaze rods produce 1200, and the soul flames produce 1600. So we actually have to add another tag here. This is going to be for fuel max, and it's literally going to be the exact same as before. Make sure we spell it correctly. Yeah, fuel max. Setting it to the same value as the other one. It's just going to be fuel max instead of fuel. Now you'll notice that we don't actually modify fuel max throughout this as we do regular fuel, because fuel max doesn't really change. It only changes when our fuel changes. So it's only necessary that you add it to this opening part of the update tick right here. And essentially what that's going to do is that's going to make it so that no matter what type of fuel you use, your flame icon for your fuel will always go to the maximum fill bar. So if instead of doing fuel divided by fuel max to get this decimal value over here, if instead of doing that you just simply checked fuel, well, what would you check it against? Because the max is changing. So if we put a soul flame in, for example, we get 1600. That's double the magma shard. So if we checked it against this, if we put a magma shard in and we checked it against the soul flame value, it would only fill that fire to about 50% full, which cosmetically could be something that you prefer and actually enjoy, but for me it doesn't very well feel all that Minecrafty, and I think it would feel more vanilla to do it the way I've done. So essentially all you need to do is just set your fuel max to the same as your fuel right here, and then for your fuel progress bar, whatever it is, for me it's my little flame image or icon, I set it to fuel divided by fuel max, and I use my little decimal values over here. If you also have 8 or I guess 9 parts, you could actually use these exact same decimal values, because all I did to get these was take 1 and divide them by 9. You know, as you can probably probably guess, but that is essentially all that fuel max is doing. Is it's just helping me determine what type of fuel was used, so that my little flame icon can be filled up all the way. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. I struggle to answer them in the comments, so if you want to make sure that your question is seen, definitely join our community Discord, and you'll probably get a faster answer that way anyways, as people are always in there helping each other out, and I'm obviously not available all the time. And specifically, if you need help with your specific GUI, you want it to work a little bit differently or anything like that, Discord is gonna be the place to be. But without further ado, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace out.